Hello everyone, I'm Deeksha Jain and I secured the 22nd rank in Civil Services Examination 2018 with English Literature as my optional. In this video, I will be discussing paper 2 of the optional as it came in the CSE 2018. The paper pattern in question number in paper 2 is similar to paper A in the sense that question number 1 and question number 5 are compulsory. Apart from that, you have to do 3 more questions in which one has to be from each section and one you can do according to your choice. So it's usually either you do 2 from section A or 2 from section B and 1 from either of the sections. Now we'll talk about the first question, which is a compulsory question. And in the first question in paper 2, we have quotations from the poetry that is there in the syllabus, and you have to analyze these lines and comment on them within a space of 10 marks, which is basically 2 sides of sheets. So question number 1A. In the nightmare of the dark, all the dogs of Europe bark, and the living nations wait, each sequestered in its hate. So here it is, although it is not necessary to mention which poem these lines have been taken from, but it is still good because then it shows that you know exactly where these lines are coming from. In this case, these lines have been taken from September 1, 1939 by W.H. Auden. So, since you have to critically comment, now if you were to do these lines, it would basically, these lines, this poem has been written at the sort of beginning of World War II. So, it is a criticism of European society and the degeneration that it has faced. And for example, the lines, and the living nations wait, each sequestered in its hate. It is talking about how nations are only looking at their personal interest and their personal hatreds. They are, plotting against each other and they're not looking at the common good of humanity. You can even connect these lines with other lines from the same poem or other ideas of Auden, because this critical view of modern life and of the period between World War I and World War II is very central to Auden's poetry. So if you can show interconnectedness between different poems or different lines of the same poem, it will also fetch you more marks. And you can also comment on, the nightmare of the dark as a symbol of the darkness of European society and of darkness of the times in which nations are moving towards war. So you can explore these symbols, you can comment on the general theme of the poem, and you can talk about the general poetry of that author and how his own philosophy is reflected in these lines. So B is, with an alien people clutching their gods, I should be glad of another death. So these lines have been taken from The Journey of the Magi by T.S. Eliot. The background of this poem is that T.S. Eliot himself, he converted to Christianity, to Catholicism, and his journey of religious conversion was a very personal and powerful aspect of his life. And this poem also talks about the journey of these 3 magi who travel somewhere from the Orient, from from a place with a different religion than Christianity. So here clutching their gods actually refers to other pagan religions, for example. And when they reach the place of the birth of Jesus and when they are initiated into Christianity, their lives transform. It is like an epiphanic movement for them. So these 2 lines are basically exploring the magnanimity of the moment of spiritual activation or spiritual enlightenment of these people, and also of T.S. Eliot in that sense. And here you can also look at I should be glad of another death. So it is basically looking at, that before these people were initiated into Christianity or they witnessed the birth of Jesus, which relates to the older myth about these 3 saints who traveled from far and they came just in time for the birth of Jesus. So it is like when they're initiated into Christianity, it is like a rebirth for them. So this poem is very religious and very spiritual, and you can explore these aspects of this poem. Question number 1C. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. These lines have been taken from The Second Coming by W.B. Yeats. Now, The Second Coming is a poem in which obviously there is a criticism of modern society and the way it has become destructive and it has, lost its rootedness in culture, in religion, etc. But apart from that, it is also an apocalyptic poem Because basically what Yeats is saying is that the best lack all conviction while the worst are full of passionate intensity. It is a comment on modern life that the people who are speaking the loudest are the ones who have hatred within them, or who don't have the right intentions, who are not working towards a better society. And while the ones who are actually who are right in their convictions, they are keeping silent, and this silence according to him is also a violation of integrity. It is not right for the people who are on the right path to remain silent and to just watch the world unfold in the way it is unfolding. You can also link this to the apocalyptic imagery that is there later in the poem about the second coming, where a monster-like creature is rising from the deserts of Bethlehem. So it is sort of how apocalypse is imagined in Christian imagery, but also it is sort of it upturns it, and the second coming, which was supposed to be the second coming of Christ, is turned into the second coming of a monster. And so this age is like basically an age of degeneration, and that is the central theme of these lines. So number D is, yet they leave us holding wretched stalks of disappointment. For though nothing balks each big approach, leaning with brass work prinked, each rope distinct. So these lines have been taken from Philip Larkin's Next Please. The poem basically talks about how human beings are always waiting for happiness in terms of promises, in terms of dreams that they have. And actually, they don't realize that everything is transitory in life, and anything. There is a famous quote that no sooner is it than it comes to past, then it turns to past. So basically, what these lines are saying is that we keep waiting for our promises, what the poem calls the armada of promises. We keep waiting for our dreams and for our successes, but when they come, they don't give us the same satisfaction. So here, wretched stocks is basically the wretched stocks of disappointment, because the happiness we thought that we will get, we are actually disappointed with what actually happens in life. So it's sort of, Philip Larkin's poetry is also about, in a sense, that a lack of meaning in life, a lack of the central, faith in the meaning of life of humanity. But at the same time, there is a lot of acceptance that even though life is like this, if we recognize that life is transitory, that life is that life may not have an overarching grand agenda, it is a much better and a saner way to live life. So you can explore that philosophy that Larkin has in these lines. The next poem is Obituary by A.K. Ramanujan, and it reads, and he left us, a changed mother, and more than one annual ritual. So this is obituary is basically an obituary on his father's death. So he's talking about his father's death. The interesting thing about these lines is, these lines say that, and he left us a changed mother and more than one ritual in a year. So it seems to say as if the narrator has not been affected by his father's death. The only effect in his life is that the mother has been really affected, and that he has to perform that ritual on the death anniversary of a person. But if you have read the poem, then later in the poem, there are very powerful lines where the narrator is looking at newspapers everywhere, just looking for that obituary of his father. So what these lines show is that even though the narrator is putting up a facade of being very cold and, sort of like heartless and not very connected with his father, there is that, deep root of connection that is there, and you can explore that sort of that dual meaning that these lines have in that respect. Okay, now let us move to question number 2. This is obviously not a compulsory question. A reads, Auden's The Shield of Achilles is a critique of contemporary culture. Elucidate. It is one of my favorite poems, and so The Shield of Achilles is a poem where the myth of the creation of Shield of Achilles by Hephaestus, who was a Greek god, is equated with the degeneration of modern society, because the shield was supposed to be very beautiful. It was supposed to have gardens and pastures and people dancing. And on the other hand, when Thetis looks at the shield, there are images of modernity, which is basically barbed wires, war, people being hanged, young children partaking in acts of violence. So what the poem does is that it puts these two images against each other, that where there should have been pastures and fields, there are scenes of war. There are also scenes of regimentality. This poem is basically a critique of contemporary culture, because then it juxtaposes the contemporary degeneration with something, an ideal, which was supposed to be there in the past. So here you can use a lot of examples. For example, there are lines about men standing in a row, and nobody knows what they are doing, but they're just moving mechanically. So it's about mechanization of life. A person is being hanged, but the people are just lazily sitting there. So it is talking about how modern man has become immune to violence. They don't feel anything if anybody else is getting hurt. Even there are lines about children where it is said that if that girls raped and one person killed another was usual for young children to hear. It was not a time where promises were one could weep if another wept. So these are the values of modern life that are being criticized by Auden in this poem by juxtaposing them with the past. So you can discuss that in this answer. B says, comment on the ending of Look Back in Anger. Does it look like being where we started, or is there indeed a hopeful no? So here, of course, everybody, each one of you can have your own interpretation as to whether the novel has ended right where it started and nothing has changed, or something has changed. My perspective on it is that the central character, Jimmy Porter, has not changed to a great extent. He was shouting, he was, sort of venting his anger, he was being violent in his ways, whether it was with his wife or with, the other girl who comes in. And that remains. He's not really changed as a character, except that he seems to be little tired of his rant in the end, because everybody has left him and then his wife comes back. But what I believe has changed in the course of it is the character of his wife undergoes a change, and there is a change in the relationship, a relationship which seemed not to have so much heart, where both the people had become immune. Like Jimmy used to keep shouting, and Allison would not respond. She would just keep mechanically doing what she was doing. So there seems to be a greater level of understanding. So you can talk about how the relationship progresses, that despite the world being without opportunities for Jimmy, despite the anger being there, there is a way that the two find to live in each other's company. There is a greater understanding between the two characters, and in a way, they are somehow more compatible than they are in the beginning. At the same time, I would like, my understanding is also that Jimmy Porter on the whole does not change. Only thing is that and that is something that is valorized about this play also. So in the answer, what you can do is that you can look at how the play starts out, and how is Jimmy's character, how are the other characters. In the end, another change is that the other characters leave the scene and only Jimmy and his wife are left on the stage. So that is also sort of a change from the beginning to the end. So you can look at these small aspects and the major aspects in terms of character transformations in the text. 2C says, the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock epitomizes the frustrations and inertia of the modern era. Justify the statement. So this is what the poem actually is doing throughout. So you won't have a lack of points or lack of evidence in this. You have to talk about how it epitomizes the frustrations and inertia of modern man. So in frustrations, firstly, you can talk about the personality of Prufrock, that he is so self-conscious that he is not able to do anything, that he is full of inertia. Throughout the poem, he keeps saying that I will ask the question, and the question is to be asked, and the matter of the question. But ultimately, he does not ask the question, and he just says, would it have been worth it after all? So it is basically that extreme self-consciousness and inertia of modern man. It is seen in other things also. There is extreme fragmentation. Prufrock says that, that I could have been claws scuttling on the floors of silent seas. So it is that absolute alienation and frustration with life, that man is reduced to something as fragmented as just scuttling claws on the floors of silent seas. The frustration is also there in social critique, like he keeps mentioning that, and the women come and go, speaking of Michelangelo. So it is a frustration with the modern life as well, the regimental quality of modern life, and he says that I'll measure my life with coffee spoons. So you can use all these evidences, and you can present beautiful answer on Prufrock, because it is about the central theme of the poem. Question number 3. A says, explicate the significance of symbols used by Yeats with reference to the poems Easter 1916, The Second Coming, and Byzantium. So Yeats's poetry is famous for its heavy symbolism. And the symbols help us in understanding Yeats's philosophy, his stand on things, and they sort of also beautify his poetry. So it is like you introduce talking about symbolism in Yeats's poetry, and then you can come towards discussing specific examples from these poems. For example, in Easter 1916, if I were to discuss certain examples, so for example, there is a line, too long a struggle can make a stone of the heart. So the symbol of heart turned into stone, and the stone is a recurring symbol in the entire poem. What does it signify? On the one hand, it talks about, the hardening of hearts because of the nationalist struggle, which is not actually leading to freedom. Hardening of hearts because so much blood has been lost and so many leaders have been lost and people have been struggling again for their independence. But the stone is also a symbol of rigidity, that when too long a sacrifice, if people keep sacrificing for too long, then they become immune to violence. And Yeats was not a supporter of violent movement for the independence of Ireland. So it is talking about the positive and the somber aspects of the nationalist struggle, as well as the rigidity of the nationalist struggle, of which Yeats was not okay with. The second coming, again, we have discussed this earlier in the short notes. Second coming, the symbol of the Antichrist, which comes in the end of the poem. He's symbolic of the degeneration of the present times, of the critique of the world wars, and the degeneration of modern life, which has lost its root and culture and which has become very regimental. So, again, symbolism is there. In Byzantium becomes a symbol of the lost world and lost glory, which Yeats wants to go to. But at the same time, he realizes that you can't just simply go to the past, and that cannot be without pain. So the symbol of dawn, that dolphin torn and gong tormented sea, that's a recurring symbol in Byzantium. So you can discuss all of those symbols and more if you have space in the answer. B says, Larkin combines wistful sadness, amusement, respect for the commonplace, and a deep compassion, discussed with reference to some of his poems. So the idea would be to take examples from almost all the poems which are there in the course, and you have to justify each aspect. So if you're talking about sadness, you can talk about that poem in which there is the prostitute is raped, and it is sort of trying to recreate that experience of extreme agony. Even Mr. Bleeny's small room evokes so much sadness, or the lives of the parents who are, very they are so lifeless in afternoons, where their life has become so regimented. There are aspects of amusement as well, whether it is in Mr. Bleeny, where the narrator is sitting and he's trying to sort of understand that what kind of life Mr. Bleeny must have had, his radio and his relationship with his landlady. Amusement in terms of the way children come to play. Amusement in terms of this this understanding of life, in terms of how the ship of life comes and goes, of promises, the armada of promises and all that. And respect for the commonplace and deep compassion, I think this is mostly most starkly evident in Mr. Bleeny, because at the end of the poem, after judging Mr. Bleeny's existence as of somebody who's been reduced to just one room, there is a deep understanding of Mr. Bleeny's relationships, real relationships that he had, that he could go on a holiday with his sister, that he had a relationship with his landlady. And the narrator, who is even more alienated than Mr. Bleeny, living in the same room, he can't even claim to have that. So there is a deep compassion for human existence in whatever flawed form it is there. So while the understanding is there that life can be meaningless, but there is also compassion for it and respect for humanity. Okay, and question number 3C. The central weakness of modernism is that in its pursuit of more complex sense of reality, it fails in coherence. Do you agree? Justify your answer with some illustrations from the 20th century poetry and drama. So, modernism, which is also a background topic for this paper, has many characteristics, and there is a lot of alienation from earlier ideas of religion, from time, coherence in plot. Even the narrator, who used to be such a trustworthy figure in earlier novels like Victorian novels, becomes like a shifty person. For example, Marlowe and Lord Jim. So there are a lot of belief systems which are getting questioned in modernism. So you can give a definition of modernism and what modern literature, how was modern literature different from earlier literature, and why it is talking about a fragmented reality. So what the statement is that in trying to capture this fragmented reality, does modern literature lose its coherence, and we have to give examples from poetry and drama. So you can give example, for example, if you look at T.S. Eliot's poetry, so it is extremely fragmented, because if you look at Prufrock, it is like a dramatic monologue, then he will suddenly shift from one place to another, the emotions keep changing, social commentary keeps changing, so there is a sense of lack of coherence. If you look at Waiting for Godot, it doesn't seem to have a plot. It seems like the first act and the second act are almost similar. And, people keep doing nonsensical things, and Godot never comes. They keep waiting for Godot. But my understanding is not in agreement with this, that in, trying to portray this complex reality, it loses coherence. The beauty of modern literature is that it is not trying to be coherent in the traditional sense. Earlier, if they wrote novel, they would show a clear development of the character, but life is not like that. Many times, a character will develop and it will go back, it will go towards happiness and come back to sadness, it will decide and then it will become undecided. Modern literature was trying to capture the ethos of the time, which was a very complex time. There were two world wars, ideas of religion, faith, humanity, time, Darwinism, everything was changing. So in its fragmented form, modern literature somehow captures the ethos of that time. So I don't think there is a need for coherence in such a literature. So that is my stand. You are, of course, please ponder over the question and come to your own conclusions, because that is what the literature paper demands of you. Okay, so coming to question number 4A. Beckett called Waiting for Godot a tragicomedy. Do you agree with this classification? If not, how would you classify the play? So personally, I agree with this classification. Yes, it is tragicomedy. So we have to sort of justify why it is a tragicomedy. It's very simple. You can start with a general introduction about Waiting for Godot, its plot, and how it is a tragicomedy. First, you can then look at the aspects of tragedy. So aspects of tragedy are what? That man's existence has been reduced to just waiting for death. That there is no grand idea. There is disillusionment with any kind of belief system which would earlier give faith to people. There are two people, Estragon and Vladimir, who keep waiting for Godot, who never comes. Tragedy is also there in Pozzo and Lucky, who have degenerated. Lucky has lost all sense of coherence, and Pozzo slowly loses his sense of arrogance, sense of time. So that is the tragedy of modern man. And at the same time, what is Beckett trying to say? Beckett is trying to say that yes, there is no grand design in this world. That maybe man's existence is actually, not towards a greater ideal. It is just there. The idea is that yes, we are all waiting for Godot, but what we do while waiting becomes important. And the comic element is there. Comedy comes in how Vladimir and Estragon pass their time. So Vladimir and Estragon, what they do is that they play games, they talk to each other, they argue with each other. The way, Lucky's speech is so incoherent, at the same time so meaningful. Comedy comes with so Beckett was really impressed with silent films and the likes of Charlie Chaplin. So the comedy is there in the actions of Vladimir and Estragon. And so this is why, I do believe that this is a tragic comedy. And you can add more points to this as you develop your own understanding of the text. Moving on to question number 4B. It is the synthesis of Ramanujan's perception of the external world with the world of his inner imaginative response, which lends an extraordinary meaning to his poems, discussed with reference to poems prescribed for study. So basically, Ramanujan's poetry is very, it's ironical, it is very tight, it is a little bit dry also. It is not very expressive, but we have to look at how Ramanujan's inner perception of his reality and the images that he uses in his poems, how he reflects his own inner being in his poems and in the perception of the external world. So you can use evidences from the poems. For example, a river which talks about Vaigai and Madurai, and how literature has degenerated and how Ramanujan himself is trying to revive it. So you can look at the inner imaginative response to the literary culture by Ramanujan when he talks about the two cows and the pregnant mother and two babies, and how he wants to revive literature by talking about the things that are important and not the things which have been traditionally spoken about. So in a repetitive manner, people keep writing about the same things. Also, like when he writes about his mother, you can talk about how his emotional attachment and that, with his mother is reflected in the images of how his mother would come through the rain and the diamonds of her earrings, or even the kind of attachment that the young baby has with the mother. So all these things are like his inner response, but they are creating the outer world of the poem. There are other poems also, like the action of a swing of a girl who is looking back at her own childhood from a more mature consciousness, thinking about her own sexuality. And it is Ramanujan's response to it also, his imagination of the flowering of a girl's sexuality, or the way one becomes nostalgic for one's childhood, and the images that he uses of a red fig tree, etc. So you can sort of combine all these images and talk about Ramanujan's interpretation and his understanding of his external world through the prism of his own symbols and his inner being. Okay, and now we'll move on to question number C. Do you find angry young man Jimmy Potter's attitude towards society credible? Is it fully worked out and resolved in the drama? Give reasons for your answer. You can start with generally talking about this angry young man figure which Jimmy Potter and John Osborne brought into the English stage. The angry young man is angry with everything. What the government is doing, the lack of employment opportunities, the frustration of the youth who has been educated but does not have adequate and satisfying jobs to do. About his anger is about the media which is trying to satisfy people with superficial news and not talking about the real things. The anger is also about the lost power of countries like Britain, because no longer does it enjoy the prosperity and the importance that it had in the international scene. So the question is this anger credible? I would say yes, the anger is credible, and that is why this play resonated so much with the audience of the time, because that anger was palpable in the society. All these issues were issues that were going on in the society. Despite educational reforms, employment was a problem. There was a huge, generation of youth which were extremely frustrated with their lives, and religion was coming into question, and all the aspects of society were coming into question. So yes, the anger is credible, I would say. Is it fully worked out and resolved in the drama? I wouldn't say that, because the anger remains anger. Jimmy Potter is not able to do anything about his anger. He keeps shouting, he keeps ranting out of his window, but he never goes out into the society and does something. He turns his anger onto his wife, his friends. He's very violent, he's very emotional, but that anger is important. And a critic has said that what starts as a drama of social criticism ends up as a drama of social despair. It is despair because this anger does not culminate into anything. It is reduced to anger and a lot of misogyny. So I would say that yes, it does not, there is no culmination to this anger. So you can again also have your own opinion about the text, but I think like this is my opinion. Let us now move to question number 5, which is again a compulsory question. So there are short notes on the novels in this paper. Okay, so question number 5A says the repetition and evolution of the symbol of echo in a passage to India. So the echo is the echo of the Malabar caves, and what does the first thing that you can talk about in this is what does the echo signify in the text. So people can have different understandings. There have been various interpretation about what the echo actually means. My particular interpretation was that echo as on the one hand, echo as a symbol of the inner misgivings and the inner fears that the colonial people had the native countries, because they were ruling over a people and they were not really interacting with them. So there were certain misgivings, and these misgivings were sort of repeated to them in the form of an echo. So when Adela Quested goes into the cave, she is very enthusiastic that she wants to see the real India and all that. But when she goes to the cave, she is confronted with her own deepest fears about the native people, and what she thinks are assumptions about the native people, that whether that she feels that she has been molested or things like that. The echo could also be if you look at it from the psychoanalytical point of view, it could be the deep unconscious, which is the in Freudian terms is called the id, which sort of, which is very difficult to understand, but that is what often drives many of our actions and our subconscious behavior. So echo, you can say that when we confront our unconscious, that could be in the form of the echo of the Malabar caves. So there are different, interpretations. You can look at it from the post-colonial perspective also, and from the psychoanalytical perspective also. Now, the repetition and evolution of the echo. Repetition of the echo, I think it sort of works as a structural device in which keeps on emphasizing the theme of the novel, of this continuous distance and discomfort between the two races, or the Indians and the Anglo-Indian people who are staying there. And so repetition is also about the central theme of the novel, the psychoanalytical part of it, and any other understanding of the repetition that you may have. Evolution of the echo, I think, is it starts as something incomprehensible. It evolves into some sort of meaning when Adela Quested comes to her senses. It also sort of it is also a symbol of the incomprehensibility, that how the colonials cannot understand the natives in a complete fashion. So, sort of as the novel progresses, it sort of shows that so long as there are unequal relationships between the Indians and the colonial masters, there will be no real understanding. So, I also see it as the evolution of the echo, that the echo is accepted as something which is not understandable at this point of time. So you may have different interpretations of the echo, but you can include as many interpretations as you want in this particular answer. Question 5b says the significance of dreams in a portrait of the artist as a young man. So the portrait of the artist as a young man is like a modern Bildungsroman. It is written in the stream of consciousness format. It follows the journey of Daedalus, right from when he is a baby till he attains a sort of consciousness as an writer, as a individual, a youth who wants to become a writer and an artist. And dreams play a very big role in this evolution of the artist. Number one, dreams are a means of exploration of his own sexuality. He has dreams about women, and he sort of tries to balance religion and sexuality, religion and the material world. And this struggle is also seen in his dreams. Dreams are also a source of creativity, because the images that he has in his dreams can also be reflected in the literature that he writes. And basically, dreams serve as a window to the unconscious and the subconscious of Daedalus as he evolves as a character in the novel. Okay, question number 5c is the relationship between Paul Morrell and his father in Sons and Lovers. This is a pretty straightforward question. In the novel, at least according to my understanding, they do have a strained relationship. In some ways, Paul Morrell, D.S. Lawrence has said that Sons and Lovers was his colliery novel, and the actual collier in the novel is Paul Morrell's father. But there is some sort of understanding about the labor that his father gives, and the kind of hard life that he has. But the relationship of Paul Morrell, who is an artist and who is more close to his mother, is strained with his father. Reasons are many. There is the violence that his father inflicts on his mother. There are scenes of domestic violence, scenes of arguments. There is also distance because his father is working class while he is moving to the middle class. His values are more middle class than working class. So that aspect of the relationship is there. And the relationship, as it physically evolves, in the beginning there is some sort of playfulness there in the relationship, but as Paul Morrell grows, he keeps moving away from his father. And even after his mother dies, his father sort of lives alone, and Morrell moves to the city. He's going to explore new frontiers. So like, I would say that the relationship is more about growing up and moving apart. And it signifies a difference when a young child who's born into a working class family grows up in middle class values and with an aspiration of moving away from his class. That also reflects in the distance between the son and the father, because both now belong to different classes. Question 5d is the theme of alienation and isolation in Lord Jim. So here, alienation and isolation should not just be seen. Of course, the central character, Lord Jim, shows these qualities. He is alienated with the world. He keeps moving from one place to the other just because he has this idea of glory and this idea of how people should see him as, as a person who has a lot of honor, and he feels that he has lost that honor. So he's alienated from the world. uh, Isolation also, because he keeps isolating himself from people. So they are there in Lord Jim as a character, but this is a theme which is there throughout the novel. This alienation can be seen in the judge who commits suicide a few days after the passing judgment on Lord Jim. It can be seen in the person who loses his consciousness and Marlowe goes to meet him to get an account of what really happened on board of the ship which gets wrecked. And alienation and isolation also when Lord Jim moves to the partisan, and his isolation from the people there is also there. So it is there in the narrator's narration, who sees this theme as permeating throughout the modern society. So I think you can look at it as alienation and isolation as a theme of the modern world, which is also reflected in the novel in many aspects of the novel. Question number 5E: the significance of the different houses in A House for Mr. Biswas. So, firstly, the symbol of the house in Mr. Biswas is multidimensional. It is a physical house because a person who moved to a new land as an indentured labor has no identity there. They live in, mud huts, and there is no sense of, that this is where I was born and this is where I have grown up, because everything is flat. Mud is washed away and there is no sense of identity. The house gives Mr. Biswas that sense of identity. That is why in his entire life he keeps aiming to have a house of his own. And as from coming from an Indian society, it is very relatable, because in developing countries, owning your own house is such a big deal. It gives you that sense of identity and rootedness in life. Another thing about the house is that the different houses that Mr. Biswas has, they show different emotions and different phases of growth. For example, when he tries to build the house in the sugarcane area, he's unable to complete it. It sort of shows that Mr. Biswas's character has not developed as much as it has to before he can actually own a house. When he gifts a toy house to his daughter Savi, and it is smashed by his wife, so it sort of shows the conflict that is there in Mr. Biswas, who's dependent on his wife's family for everything. Even the final house that Mr. Biswas gets is not perfect, because he's still under heavy loan. The walls are crooked. There are certain, problems with the house. But even then, at the end of it, I think there is a sense of satisfaction that finally Mr. Biswas has a sense of identity. So these different houses show different aspects of his life. And, the novel ultimately talks about the sense of identity that a house can give a person. And also the sense of void which can never be filled, however many houses you build. So both aspects are there in this answer. Now we move to question number 6A. Examine the relationship between war and madness as represented in Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway. So both madness and war are the central themes of this novel. In terms of war, we have, there are many representations. There are people who have maimed, they don't have hands or legs, they're moving in, the London scape. There is Septimus, who is a war veteran and who has returned from war, and he has gone mad. He's slowly, he's losing his senses. There are people like Mrs. Dalloway herself, who thinks that, she feels that she's going mad. She feels that she's not affected by the war, but the world around her has changed to a great extent. How, and the novel also talks about madness, specifically through the character of Septimus Smith, in terms of one, madness in the sense that he's losing his touch with reality. He imagines things where they are not there. Madness also in the sense that madness in a good way, in a way that madness gives him that space that he can think more clearly than people who think that they are sane. Septimus, when he is mad, talks about peace, communication, saving trees, love. And he talks about these values, and these values seem to be missing in a world which is obsessed with war. The society which is sane, like Mr. Bradshaw or all the elite people of the government, who are in ways preparing for the Second World War, who are okay with the idea of war. So Virginia Woolf is really asking the question that who is really mad? Is Septimus, who appears to be mad but is more, sane philosophically than these people? Is he mad? Or are these people who think that war is okay, that the loss of life and, the lack of love in the society is all right? Or are these people mad? So there is this constant conflict between what madness really constitutes. You can also talk about Virginia Woolf herself, the author, because she had suffered a lot of mental illnesses, and she ultimately committed suicide. And she has a very beautiful letter that she wrote before she committed suicide to her husband. So in a way, it is coming from very a person who understands how she was also a person like who lost relatives and people in the war. So she's a person like she understands the pain of war as well as what madness can feel like. So both of these things are really interrelated in the text. Question number 6b: how far is it correct to claim that the theme of Sons and Lovers is the growth of individual beings in a working class environment? So I've spoken about this earlier also. D.H. Lawrence called Sons and Lovers a colliery novel because he had himself come from a colliery background. His father was a collier, and his individual story was also of a person who moved from a working class background to create his own individual identity as an artist and as a novelist. The novel also talks about this, the growth of the individual. The central character of the novel is Paul Morel, and he, despite being from a working class background, he receives an education. His mother is a petty bourgeois, so he has certain middle class values. The focus of the novel is not about how the working class on the whole can improve. It is not a working class novel to the extent that it is going to talk about, developing the working class, improving their working conditions, talking about the health issues that the working class has. It refers to those issues very obliquely, but what it talks about is that despite circumstances, despite the social scenario that surrounds us, how can an individual move beyond his circumstances to carve out his own identity in the world? What Paul Morel does is that despite being poor, despite having all these constraints, he carves his own identity as a painter, and he also educates himself, and finally he moves to the city. The novel ends with the image of Paul Morel clutching his fists and walking very, purposefully towards the city. So that is a symbol of him finding his own identity, of leaving his working class background behind. So you can explore this answer on these lines using evidences from the text. Question number 6c is Kanthapura more concerned with the reform in our dominant religion and culture than with political protests against the colonial domination? Explained from the perspective of colonialism and post-colonialism. So my understanding of this answer is this, that the colonial perspective would see Indian freedom struggle as something which is not clear in its objective. Do we want religious reform or do we want national, independence? Are we really focused in our purpose? And it is, they might also look at the struggle as being, non-violence as being a weakness. But how I see it from a post-colonial perspective and how I try to understand this text is that it is a wrong, it is a sort of a limited view of the national struggle and of the scenario which is there in Kanthapura to look at it only from one, from one lens, that it is a text of religious reform or it is a text of national independence or the struggle for national independence. Actually, the Indian independence struggle always took these two things together. We always took social reform, religious reform, and national independence to be, going hand in hand. Because unless we improve our own old society, we improve our own social structures, we won't really able to be a strong and coherent society. Even if the people who are ruling over us leave, then will we be a society worth, saving? So it was important. That is why Gandhiji always focused that women empowerment, religious reform, he was against casteism also. And that is how the text also goes. It takes both religious reform and national struggle in the same vein, and it sees both as attaining the same objective. So this is how I understood the text. You can use textual evidences to substantiate this viewpoint. Let us now move to question number 7a. A house for Mr. Biswas is a Bildungsroman with a difference. Discuss. Firstly, what is a Bildungsroman? A Bildungsroman traditionally was a story of the growth of a character from childhood to a stage where, usually in a stage in youth, from where the character would, attain a certain sort of settlement, would be settled, would be married, things like that. Traditionally, that was a Bildungsroman. So, how so Mr. Biswas a Bildungsroman with a difference? Difference is in that, yes, it starts with Mr. Biswas as a child and it follows his journey as he grows. But it does not stop at his youth. It follows Mr. Biswas's journey right till his death. The other major difference is that, while in a traditional Bildungsroman, the character would be settled and would get married at the end of the novel, would have certain sense of, would finish his education. What the novel shows that after finishing his education, after getting married, there is a sense of unsettledness in Mr. Biswas's life. He keeps feeling that void throughout his life. So, in a way, what the novel is doing is that it is stretching out the Bildungsroman. It is not stopping at the youth. It is exploring not just the good side of the youth, but it is exploring the sinister sides as well. And it is doing it throughout the life of the character. Another, the final point that this Bildungsroman with a difference makes is that who can have a proper Bildungsroman? If it is the novel is actually about the story of a displaced people, the indentured labor which went from India to other countries, and there they settled in a new society. They are trying to create a sense of identity which is lacking in themselves. So, in a way, the novel is saying that these people cannot have a traditional Bildungsroman because they don't have a traditional sense of rooted identity. Their entire life is concerned with that sense of identity, and that is why the Bildungsroman, it does not stop with the youth. It is the exploration of this psychosis of lack of identity, of this non-rootedness throughout the life. So I think that is what Bildungsroman with a difference means in this context. Question number 7b says, what are the ways in which Stephen prepares himself for life as an artist? How is the process related to Joyce's view of the role of an artist in society? It's pretty straightforward and related to the prop. How does Stephen prepare himself for the life as an artist? I think one way in which he does this is by exploring different extremes of life. At one point of time, when he goes to school, he's like a very self-conscious child, and then he goes into a very he starts exploring his sexuality with his dreams. He goes to prostitutes also in between, and then he becomes extremely religious. So he goes to the other end, and he tries to find meaning in faith. But it is in this contrast and in this self exploration that he realizes that that is not the life which will give him happiness. It is that epiphany where he sees that girl in the water that he realizes that he wants to become an artist. And that is, so one part of it is by experiencing these two extremes, he prepares himself as an artist. And after that, as a student, Stephen continuously tries to evolve his own theory of art. So there is this section where he talks about claritas, and the there are three aspects of art according to him. So he's trying to understand what his art will be like. Towards the end, Stephen Daedalus' idea of an artist and what art is focused a lot on independence. He says that I don't belong to a nation, I don't belong to people, I have no identity except that which I give myself. And that is related to how Joyce viewed the artist's responsibility. The artist as an objective observer of society, an artist who does not have any baggage of nationality or of belonging to a particular class or of belonging to any religion. The artist is being a free bird. So when Stephen Daedalus moves out from college and out there exploring the world, so he's experiencing that freedom, and that is how he wants his art to be. He wants his art to be free. So you can talk about that growth of character and that development of an artist. The title of the novel itself is Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man. So the novel explores how an artist grows right from when he's a baby right to when he realizes his ambition of becoming an artist. Question number 7c, a man that is born falls into a dream like a man who falls into the sea. To what extent could Stein's comment on Lord Jim be taken as a final assessment of the character of Lord Jim? Here, falling into a dream, in my interpretation, is dream here, I think, refers to all the belief systems that we have. And Lord Jim, in this particular instance, he has a lot of belief systems of how ideally a man should behave. the idea of glory that he has, of being brave, and this fear that he has of social ostracization and of disrespect in the society, which is why he keeps roaming from one place to another. It is in his death that when he finally goes and voluntarily gives up his life, that he's very proud of himself because he feels that he has reached that ideal. But when Stein says that a man is born and falls into a dream like a man who drowns in the sea, so basically, what it is saying is that these ideas of glory, of conduct, of being the bigger man, are all false notions, because ultimately, in the modern scenario, life does not conform to these grand designs which were believed in Victorian era. In Victorian era, there was a lot of emphasis on morals and proper conduct and bravery. But in modern era, people realize that if it is only superficial, it is not really bravery. Because if you can even look at it in the colonial context, that these people, everybody knows that basically the author is supposed to be one of the authors who critiques colonialism. So what he's also saying is that if you are a colonial person, you're going to the other country, you're subjugating other people, and you think that you're being brave, then it is actually an illusion. So in a way, what what Stein is also saying is that it is an illusion that colonizers have created for themselves, that we are being brave by conquering all these places, but in fact what we are doing is we are actually serving our own personal interest, that is to earn money and to sort of become wealthy, which is all colonialism was about. So yes, to Lord Jim it does apply to a certain extent because of his idea of valor and bravery, but also in the larger extent to the colonial enterprise as a whole. So let us now move to question number 8a. Generally, the Indian characters in A Passage of India are less convincingly portrayed than the English characters. Do you agree? Give reasons for your answer. I agree with this to some extent. Yes, there are very endearing Indian characters like Aziz, or actually mainly Aziz. But what happens is that this book, it is a critique of the colonial enterprise and the way the Anglo-Indians behave in India, a behavior which will actually not be condoned if they were behaving like that in their own country, but they are arrogant, and they don't they behave with such haughtiness when they are in India because they feel that sense of superiority. The criticism of that is very good in the novel. Even the character of Aziz is very endearing. The character of Mr. Fielding is very well carved out because he has a certain understanding of what is right and wrong, and he is really brave in supporting Aziz against the other Anglo Indians in the novel. But what I feel is that the Indian characters in general have been, painted with a very broad brush. For example, like even Aziz, despite, being a doctor, despite being very competent, he's supposed to be a person who is very emotional, who cannot get control over his emotions, who can be manipulated by other people. Now, this is also one of the stereotypes about Indians, that that Indians are too emotional, they are not rational enough to understand, and they are very, manipulative and all that. Even if you look at the character of Godbole, now Godbole is supposed to be a Brahmin, but the way he's described, he wears funny clothes, he's always talking about the other world, he's very vague in his answers and all that. So it is sort of that is also a kind of stereotyping, because we never really know about Godbole's intentions, his personal life. You're just told that he's sort of like a mystical man, so that doesn't really it does not show a well defined character. Another would be that Pankhawala, because Pankhawala is a representation of the lower caste and the the absolute destitute and the poor of the country. And the Pankhawala does not get a single line. He's just mute. He's moving the pankha. His body is being objectified. He's being viewed by the author, and he's representing the subjugation and the poverty of the country. But there is no voice that he is given. So to that extent, I feel that yes, the Indian characters are less convincingly portrayed than the English characters. Question number 8b says, Raja Rao was greatly influenced by what the Irish politician Daniel O'Connell said: nothing is politically right which is morally wrong, and this was supported by Gandhi. How far is it correct to read Kanthapura in the light of this statement? In the previous answer that we discussed, we talked about how the Indian national struggle and the world of Kantapura, the Gandhian struggle of Kantapura, is about social reform, religious reform, along with the political reform. So here also, what Raja Rao portrays in the novel is that if a society is morally wrong in terms of the caste system being morally wrong, the gender disparity, the way women are not educated, child marriage, and all these problems are there, so long as these moral problems are there in our society, it is pointless to fight for political independence. So the political struggle has to be along with the moral struggle. And to that extent, Raja Rao's novel shows that. So you can use various evidences from the text to support this argument. Question number 8C says, Mrs. Dalloway has no conventional plot or action. It conveys to us only some moments of psychological illumination. Discuss. I agree that the lack of conventional plot, because you can introduce it by saying that Mrs. Dalloway is a stream of consciousness novel, so it does not have dialogues. It moves from one person's thoughts to the other person's thought, and that is how the entire story is woven. The plot is also not conventional to the extent that it does not form a linear narrative from past to present. It keeps on going from past to present as the minds of people and the memories of people are triggered. And yes, it does convey moments of psychological illumination, whether it is in those Christ-like illuminated talks of Septimus, when he says that we should not destroy it, we should save trees, we should there should be more communication and there should be universal love. Or whether there is illumination in Mrs. Dalloway herself, when she sort of looks at herself and there is this acute sense of sadness, because this whole image that she has created of herself as a socialite who's very good at organizing parties, and within herself she's extremely sad. So yes, there are these moments of psychological illumination, but I don't think that it is an incoherent plot. It is just a different plot. It is not a conventional plot, but it is trying to come to terms with a very complex reality in its own very innovative way. So I think that apart from giving moments of psychological illumination, I think that these moments actually give meaning to the entire novel and sort of give a shape to the plot of the novel. So that was my answer to this question. And you can also look at these answers in other dimensions as you will analyze the text on your own. And one more thing that I would like to add is that the paper 2 is much more vague and complex, but it gives much more room for self-interpretation. So you can take a lot of liberty in terms of psychoanalytical analysis, exploring multiple dimensions of symbolism, which is heavily used in paper 2.